How you going?
Hey, how you doing?
I'm pretty good.
So I hear you're the heavyweight champion of CallOut.
Yeah,
Is that right?
look, Yaz talks me up a bunch. I have won a couple of these tournaments, but as you can see, I am no heavyweight. So,
Well, I'm a heavyweight, but I'm nowhere near winning any of these tournaments. So hopefully you'll take it easy on me.
oh, so good. So, kick us off with what you mean by the topic.
Okay, I hope to establish through our conversation that free will is in fact a myth. As you said, it functionally exists in that most of us operate under the guise of believing that free will exists. We all think we have choices. We all think we make those choices of our free volition. But in all actuality, causation, cause and effect, and essentially determinism, in my theory, is what ultimately decides everything that we're going to do at any given moment. Mm-hmm. What I hope to establish also is that the root of egotistical thought is derived from the assumption of a libertarian free will. Egos are essentially boosted by the idea that something comes from yourself rather than somewhere else. And I hope that we can agree that ego has been at the root of just about every problem our world has faced that's been due to humanity.
Okay, right, interesting. So this isn't exactly how I thought you'd go with the motion, but yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I guess my burden would be twofold. One would be to defend individualism, and I suppose the corollary of that is also defending notions of free will and whatnot. And then the second thing is to propose an alternate cultural affliction, which is, a greater impediment to the prosperity. So I imagine we'll probably spend a little bit of time on the first one. But to just clarify, I think that cultural relativism is probably a greater impediment to cultural progress. And maybe we can talk about that afterwards. But it's your debate, so we should probably spend some time unpacking the first couple of premises you laid out. So you talked about that free will doesn't exist, and I have heard these arguments. So the argument is basically something like, we know that the physical world is governed by cause and effect. The brain is part of the physical world. It makes no sense then that it would also not be governed by cause and effect. Okay, so the reason I do find this persuasive, but I'm not totally persuaded by it. And the reason is that we just don't know enough about the brain. I don't know if you've got any friends who've studied psychology and stuff at university, but the amount of knowledge we have about the brain is really, really small. There's so much that we don't know which is going on there. So if we were to find some sort of complexity which resulted in free will, that would be the place to find it. It is, kind of the bottom of the ocean of the human body, if it will. And the way I think this plays out in the real world is that, say for example, you learn that the world is deterministic. Like, what do you do with that? Do you know what I mean? Like, we know that we can still we know that, for example, even if it is deterministic, that there are still cause and effect relations, right? Which is to say that the things we do and the things which we do with other people have an effect. You could argue, for example, that me persuading you in this debate might have an effect on your behavior going forward. Even if it is deterministic, I don't think it absolves anyone of any responsibility, because you still are as much of a cause, even if your actions are just the effect of another cause. So yeah, I don't quite understand how it results in anyone of responsibility. I'd really like to hear your ego arguments in more depth, because I'm not quite sure what the link between this and the ego and the problem is, but I'll kick it back to you.
Okay. I would like to also address some of your points on free will, and I would like to also say that I am not trying to absolve anyone of responsibility to society, which is essentially what we would be asking about if we were to say that there is no free will. Can we therefore just blame society for everything that each individual does? It would not be, if we were to institutionalize, say, for example, the idea of teaching people that we live in a causal universe and that free will is essentially a myth, we should then have a discussion about what society is and what we owe to society and what infractions within that society would constitute address. For example, it's not necessarily it's not necessarily a crime and punishment, so to speak, but it's more like infraction and point of address. The point of action is always the most legitimate to address when you're dealing with an infraction to society. You say, well, this person killed somebody. They may have done it for reasons that were outside of their own control, but the fact is they still killed somebody, and the most legitimate place to address that issue is at the point of infraction. So that takes the whole responsibility argument out the window. We don't really need to worry about responsibility because there is still essentially responsibility to society even without free will.
So to be clear, you're saying that the element of the law, like moral condemnation and like those sorts of deterrent style elements, and the retributive justice and everything associated with murder, that shouldn't be a feature.
Oh, the way you define it as in retributive, I'm sorry, can you repeat that word?
So I'm trying to suss out what the difference between the legal system now and the legal system as you imagine it would be. So you're saying doing things at the point of address, which I assume you mean to be when the murder has happened, which is kind of how already how it works, right? Murder happens,
exactly.
Person goes to yeah. Exactly. So what I'm saying is that is the stuff about, for example, how the law has moral condemnation under the status quo, and how the justice isn't just about putting someone away to incapacitate. It's also about retributive is like retribution, right? Providing retribution for the family. So you're saying those things shouldn't be there.
Right. The effect on the family is legitimate, and there should be some things built into society to help those people. But the tit for tat, eye for an eye mentality should not necessarily apply, because basically we're drawing a conclusion, a causal conclusion, when we have so little information. Just like I've pointed out, and you pointed out, if we're in a deterministic universe, what exactly do we do with that? Well, the fact of the matter is we cannot predict a deterministic universe, even if we know that it exists. There are just so many factors that go into causation that we shouldn't try to. We should always attempt to try to find causation, but we should never be conclusive about it.
So I guess the question there would be, what if there are just some function, like so we know by and large, and I know there are some exceptions, that societies which have strong cultures of immorality around certain acts like murder and make them illegal and offer retributive justice, like they have less murders, because even in a cause and effect universe, the fact that there is moral condemnation, even if it is, I guess, under your paradigm of determinism, a little bit fallacious, the fact that it's there still influences people's actions. So wouldn't you just kind of cop it to reduce murder?
Well, I think you're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I think you can still maintain those things while still acknowledging that there doesn't have to be a moral condemnation, but a condemnation as an infraction to society. Functioning society works better without murder. The person commits a murder, they are then condemned by society because they are outside of their rights to do so.
Yeah, I just don't think that this is something which people are going to be happy living with. So it's because when people have crimes committed against them, they don't feel like they are the ambassador of society who has just been like kind of infracted upon in some nebulous way. They feel personally attacked, and when other people in the society see crime happen, most of the time they don't feel infracted upon as a society to the same degree as the person who's actually the victim does. So it seems to me that people's moral intuitions, and you could definitely argue that the moral intuitions are flawed, but people's moral intuitions do bend them towards ideas of that eye for an eye, which is why the legal system should involve some element of that. And then the implication is that if you think the universe is all cause and effect, then there are probably effects to not recognizing those feelings people have. So, for example, victim feels personally victimized, wants to do things like victim impact statements, right? Which a victim impact statement doesn't make much sense in a society infraction paradigm, because like what place does your feeling about victimization have if the only infraction is kind of like a deterministic societal one? So if you got rid of that, then you actually deny a lot of like personal justice to the victim, and that might, for example, have poor effects on their mental health. Or if you say, for example, remove the moral condemnation, you get a lot more people just saying, "Oh, well, society made me do it," and crime increases. So what I'm trying to get at is that there are like pragmatic reasons to go with a notion of free will, even if in like theory that we're not 100% certain it exists.
Well, I can definitely agree those pragmatic reasons, but I think to a large degree those pragmatic things exist because they grew out of our already assumptive free will that is built into our culture. You see, what I'm trying to do is, and like I said earlier in the comments, I have very little empirical basis to work from, because we live in a world that is so just so saturated with this idea of libertarian free will that we don't know what it would be like if we were in early life to adopt a more deterministic view on the world. What I think would happen would there would be a decrease in ego, and that decrease in ego would result in people who had their family members murdered feeling a little bit less hatred towards that one person and more hatred towards the environment that one person grew up in. You see, it brings about a greater understanding, even though that understanding is less solid than the understanding of this person murdered my family member, this person is guilty. That's much more solid and much more easy to swallow. But when you adopt a more deterministic, more causal idea of the universe, it gives you perspective, even when that perspective is sort of open-ended and not certain.
You're right. So to be clear, your argument is that the status quo functionally indoctrinates everyone into thinking that there's a hard like nurture approach, but your theory is that if you were to just indoctrinate people to believe in like collectivism or like in like the non-free will determinism, then we wouldn't feel as personally ego aggrieved. I think one thing which is somewhat paradoxical about that argument is that what you're saying is that that we ought to adopt a nature, like in the nature versus nurture argument, we ought to adopt a nature-centered approach, that there are some things which we cannot change, right? Like you know, the cause and effect of the universe, but your mechanism for teaching that is reliant on a nurture-centered approach, right? Does that kind of make sense, that you're saying we need to change everyone to believe that they cannot be changed and that it is just a deterministic?
Well, let me just establish that libertarian free will is a practice in ignorance. It is not until you go a little bit further and educate yourself a little bit further that you discover that libertarian free will isn't necessarily possible. It's an incompatibilist theory in terms of free will and determinism. They can't exist, and even in indeterminism, free will necessarily can't exist. But can
you explain that? Sorry. Yeah, can you explain why that's the case? And so, can you just clarify for me? Is there a difference between free will and libertarian free will, and why is it that even in an indeterministic universe it doesn't make sense?
Well, free will in an indeterministic universe, you would never come to a decision. In an indeterministic universe, you could never come to a decision because it would in itself be causal.
Why couldn't you come to a decision?
Well, because you would have nothing to lead you to that decision. Because everything is chaotic, everything is indeterminate.
Yeah. So surely the counter argument is just that it's possible to make a bad decision. So you just presented all of the causes.
Well, whenever you make any given decision at any time, you always think at that moment when you're making the decision that it is the best choice. It's only later that you get regret.
Yeah.
In any given moment, everyone is making the right decision for them at that moment in their own mind. That's why it's ego and free will belief makes people believe that some people are inherently evil, when in their own truth they are doing the right thing. They may later think that that was really evil of me to do that, but at the moment they thought it was the best thing for them at that time.
I don't agree with that. I don't actually agree that people always think that it's the best thing at the time. Like, talk to anyone who's procrastinated, for example, and they're always like, or someone who eats chocolate. They're like, I know this is going to be bad for me later, or like, like the massive swath of the population who at New Year's commits to going to the gym and then never goes. Do you know what I mean? Like, these people know their decisions aren't good for them.
There are always many influences taking effect at any given time, but there's always a stronger influence. And the stronger influence is always the one you will inevitably decide on in the moment. At the time that you make the decision, in the moment, the strongest influence on you is going to have the most effect. And that will lead you to the decision that you make. Now, later down the road, you may find that another influence should have been stronger and would have made you had a better decision. But at the time, that influence was not strong enough to color your decision.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that maybe that influence, there is like just a free will governing which one of those influences you pay attention to. Because, for example, right, like you said it's about making the best decision or making a good decision. Like, what does good mean? Good has so many axioms. Is it good for you? Is it good for you and your people? Is it good for you and your people and everyone else's people? Is it good for you now, tomorrow, next week? Like you can direct yourself to a good in a particular like you could, hang on, let me clarify this properly. You could act, for example, good in the short term, full well knowing that there are long-term consequences. You just didn't know what they were. So later on you come to regret it. That's not causality. You've just made an error.
Well, the good in my definition of good here is actually the strongest influence. The strongest influence being the good in your mind is what is going to essentially become your decision. You may think, I'd like to eat some peanut butter, but I'd like to lose some weight. Well, if your desire to eat peanut butter is stronger, then that becomes the good of the moment. If your desire to lose weight is stronger, then not eating becomes the good of that moment. And that's why good and evil are simply pretty relative based on your goals and your desires.
Yeah, okay, but I guess the question is then, if you're talking about your desires, then that is getting very, very close to free will, right? Because now you're not really talking about external influences that much.
But you don't get to choose your desires. Your desires are dictated to you by the universe and your surroundings, and also your DNA, which goes back to evolution and previous experiences by previous members of your line of evolution.
Yep. I get it, but you are drawing connections which we do not know exist, because like when you, so for example, I could say, look, there are lots of people who grow up in the same society and they get educated all their life that drugs are wrong, right? And then they there are laws and consequences. Like, there are really, like, some of them may even had family members who have died of drugs, and they do them anyway, right? Some of them, yes, you could say they do them because of peer pressure, but a lot of people just do them at home, and do it anyway. And even like cigarettes is a classic one, right? Where everyone, there are people whose parents have died of smoking, who smoke, and so it makes no sense to say that, oh well, look, just the desire for the cigarette was stronger at the time. Well, who decides the strength of the desire? Because if we can see from multiple different actors that the strength of the desire is changing between them, then you need to say, oh, well, it's in the DNA, right? That maybe the DNA predisposes you to finding certain desires to be stronger. But then why is it that then over time, when they quit, how is it that those desires changed? Like, as their DNA hasn't changed, but their decision has. So it seems that you have to, yeah. Oh, you go.
Okay. Well, determinism isn't exactly fatalism. Determinism is happening all the time in every moment. At one time, the strength to smoke a cigarette is stronger with one particular person because they had an uncle who smoked that they really liked. And that uncle was the friendliest, greatest guy. And then somebody who didn't want to smoke had an uncle that they didn't like. And these are, you know, in the millions and billions of different factors that are happening within your brain that have predisposed you. They have conditioned you. Your environment has conditioned you to make the decisions you make. The person deciding to take drugs has had the DARE classes or the anti-drug classes in their schools, but they've also had other experiences throughout their lives, which cannot necessarily be quantified by us. We don't have the intelligence, we don't have the perspective, we don't have the objectivity to quantify causation. But we do know that different things happen to different people, and that's why different people make different decisions.
No, but you see, what I'm pointing to though is that there are lots of people who don't have different things done to them and still end up making different decisions. Or people, for example, like there are lots of people whose parents and whose grandparents have died of smoking, who go on to smoke. So even when the influence should have the opposite effect, they still do the wrong thing. So
that's just your perspective of the influence, though.
Yeah. So then that is bringing it back to the person, right? Now it's about not just what the influence is, but their perspective on the influence. And what I'm asking is, where does that perspective come from? Does that make sense?
It comes from your experiences. It comes from your DNA. It comes from the way your brain acts, which is built on your DNA and through evolution. Here's the thing. What is free will but another god of the gaps? I mean, free will is basically something we assume we have because it's the simplest solution. You know, it's basically we don't know what caused us to make this decision. So what do? We just say we wanted to. You know, we're filling in the gaps.
The way that you've been arguing for determinism makes it look like determinism is the god of the gaps. Because whenever I'm like, oh, well, what about the person who's had the same experience? Like, oh, well, that must have been that must have been their experiences. Like, what if, I'm like, okay, well, what if they had different ones? You're like, oh, it must be their DNA. It's like, okay, then with their DNA, why didn't their decision change over time? It's like, oh, it must be something else. This is the thing about the universe, is it gives you an infinite amount of potential causal things to point at. And whenever I point out there are pretty problem situations, you just shift your finger to another one. So that really is the god of it. That's the god of the gaps argument. It kind of falls more on your court, I think.
I suppose it does, but I mean, cause and effect is pretty established. Would you not agree?
Yeah, look, yes, but also brain science is definitely not established.
Right, that's right. So if free will cannot be disproved, why should we assume it? See, usually when someone assumes God exists, they say that the onus is on the person who makes the assumption that it exists. The positive statement is the one that has the burden of proof. And so I'm saying that we don't have anything that says we can say this thing was caused by something that came from a person with no influence whatsoever. A marble started rolling without being acted upon, without another force. We don't have examples of this in reality. We do have some theoretical examples through mathematical calculations in quantum physics that say, hey, if something moves here a long way away, something else moves in the same way, and there doesn't seem to be any connection. Then again, we have a gap again. But I mean, that's the closest we have come to uncaused causes. And so by assuming free will, you're putting the burden of proof on yourself.
No, okay. So the burden of proof is actually just a debating trick, because there's nothing which distinguishes there is free will and there isn't free will as positive claims, because it's all governed by determinism is just as much of a positive claim as there is free will. So the burden of proof is equal amongst both of us. As an example of something which doesn't appear to have a clear causal link, have you heard of the double slit experiment?
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah. And so how, you know, the photon, if you fire the single photon, it for some reason has a dispersion pattern. But then if you try to film which slit it goes through, the dispersion pattern ceases to exist. Like that's not that doesn't have a clear cause and effect relationship, for example. Like why a photon would have an interference pattern with itself and why that would disappear when measured. So like that's not evidence of free will, but it's evidence that our understanding of cause and effect is not complete, if that makes sense.
I can agree with that. I have some theories on to why things like that happen, but you know, I believe that is due to our subjectivity, our perspective, essentially. And
Right.
what you get is you're dealing with a lack of information. You've only got your one subjective view, and you see it go one way, and you see it go another way. Yeah, you can't see why it goes one way or the other way.
It's not just like someone thinks it's going one way or the other way. Like it's filmed. You know, like there are machines who don't have.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make it sound like I didn't understand. I do understand that it does go one way or it does go the other way. But what I'm saying is our lack of perspective, our lack of objectivity, disallows us for seeing the causation behind it. Okay, because we do not see the causation, we assume that there are uncaused causes.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess bringing it back to the earlier premise in the debate, since I think we can pretty much agree in this conversation, it is highly unlikely that we'll be able to solve the free will problem. But I think we both have been fairly good ambassadors of those arguments. I think that the real question is, does it affect the culture in a negative way? And what I would suggest is that the way in which most people internalize the free will discussion is one which gives them responsibility. Yes, it gives them ego, right? The idea that they are important. But I think that's okay and good as well. And I would suggest the alternative, that where they think that, you know, it's all just caused by the universe, is one which is likely to have bad effects. So I'll start with the second one, right? When you were saying that if people just were brought up to believe that, look, it's all deterministic, I think there is a high chance that even in a deterministic framework would lead people to absolve themselves of responsibility for their worst impulses. Because we all agree, as you were mentioning earlier, that you're always dealing with a set of competing desires, and sometimes one of those desires overrides the other one. In a deterministic framework, the education you receive will still play into which one of those desires is the most influential. What I suggest is that our education system, which tells people that all of those things are just determined by the universe, is one which is likely to absolve people of responsibility for succumbing to the worst desires. Because no longer is there this overarching moral judgment which says, no, you ought to choose the best thing. It's just, they're all there and we can't really measure it, but one of them will be stronger. And I think that'll give people a reason to rationalize why they should, for example, not take care of their family, or they should gamble all their money away in the short term, or they should cheat on their partner. And that, I think, will actually be a bigger impediment on social progress. Whereas if there's an education system which says, you are dealing with these desires all at the same time, and it's on you to do the best one, that means that people are like basically kind of guilted into doing the one which is better. And that actually in the net leads people to make better decisions. So that's why I would say that the free will paradigm is better for society than the determinism one.
Well, and that's a very good point, but I would like to point out that what you're saying, I'm having some feedback here. I'd like to point out that what you're saying is that people will not feel guilty in this world where determinism is adopted, and I disagree. Because in this world where determinism is adopted, society becomes ever increasingly important, and how society affects people becomes ever increasingly important. And also the maintenance of society becomes more important, and the infraction of society becomes guilt. And that's essentially what law and order has become. It's not necessarily right and wrong. I mean, we like to say it is right and wrong, and murder's pretty easy to say that relatively the fact that we're all human beings and we live on the same planet, we can all agree that murder is wrong. But in essence, it's society's law that says that certain things are wrong, and they're not necessarily right or wrong unless you take them in perspective of society and what society's trying to accomplish. I just feel like what I'm talking about is a greater understanding, and what you're talking about is a less developed idea. Basically, the person who's believed in free will their entire life, all of a sudden is told free will doesn't exist, but has very little understanding of its implications, will maybe decide that, hey, I can go out and get away with murder. But someone who understands the full extent of it, and I feel like if it was taught in a better way, they would. And I guess
Yeah,
I'm
look,
just trying to raise the bar.
okay. I think you're right to point to an ideal, but I think you at least have to you have to show some plausibility, because, for example, the argument you just made, you could apply to any system of thought, right? You could say, look, you don't know what it's like to be a religious fundamentalist. If you were grown up teaching by the word properly your entire life, then everything would be great. In the same way in which if only you learned determinism from a young age, everything would be fine. So I don't think you can necessarily know true Scotsman your way out of every single instance of someone believing that society was at fault. Because, for example, I can point to, at the moment, there are lots of people out there who do believe in a lot of the premises of determinism, and who do believe that society's ails are actually what makes individuals do bad things. So, for example, left wingers who are very concerned with the way in which government influences crime, for example, always point to things like, well, look, like geographical and racial disparities in crime aren't caused by people being immoral. They're caused by things like wealth disparities. They're caused by things like the policing policy of the state. So these people are making deterministic arguments, right? They're saying that it is the external factors. And do these people tend to be the ones who respect society the most? Like, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think a lot of those actors are the ones who are the bring down the state. They're the ones who we need a revolution. So I don't think there is a clear-cut line between believing that society is at fault for things and then respecting society. I actually think that tends to go the other way, because the more you think that actually it is all external factors, the more you can look at the society and go, the external factors are responsible for everything which has gone wrong in my life, and then develop a resentment. So just because you think external factors are determining your fate doesn't mean that you would then respect the source of those external factors. In some cases, it might make you reject it.
I would have to disagree with you. In America, patriotism is a very debatable topic, because you have what's called blind patriotism, and then you have what's called critical patriotism, which is people being critical of their country and respecting it at the same time. And I think that's exactly what I'm talking about. And you're talking about more of a blind patriotism. And just to make kind of an allusion to what we're talking about, I think both do exist, but I think in essence, what you're going to have is a better result from critical patriotism than you do to blind patriotism. Just like saying that I blindly believe I cause all the things that I cause, or I know that I cause all the things that I cause, but I know that there are also reasons for it, and that keeps me from growing a strong ego.
But that goes both ways, because then I can say that, well, you're talking about the ails of blind free will allegiance, but I'm talking about critical free will allegiance, where you recognize you have free will, but that doesn't mean that you're the most important thing and that your free will affects other people's free will. And that's where, for example, libertarians are actually quite good on things like the non-aggression principle, right? Because if you govern free will, then one of the things which is very important is that you don't impede other people's free will. So you end up actually getting some societal and collective impulses, even starting from the premise of free will is very important. Like, obviously, both of us are allowed to advocate for the best form of our thing, but I think it's important for us to also recognize that there is a worst form of our thing, and then ask which one is that likely to manifest? And what I would say is that the worst form of the determinism is one which is likely to happen because it is governed out of our worst impulses, the ones which are the hardest to control, the ones which say, oh, well, the blame must be somewhere else, or I just couldn't help it. And that's what makes people vulnerable to making the bad decisions with a deterministic mindset, whereas the free will mindset makes the decisions which are the easiest to make from impulse the hardest to make intellectually, because it morally condemns you for making those decisions. Whereas the sort of like radically egocentric the I am the most important thing, free will isn't really an impulse. That's more of an over intellectualization of a free will, which is why not as many people do it. By your own characterization, this is something which lots of people have been taught from birth, that there is free will, but there is a very small amount of people who are radical libertarians, which suggests that the hazard of that happening is actually quite low. Whereas I think the hazard of the person who absolves themselves of all responsibility under the deterministic mindset is probably quite high. Hopefully that makes sense.
It does make sense. I would like to point out that the polarities that you speak of, the worst and the best of the two ideas, exist in today's world. And it's the world that we're very aware of, and that's the world where a libertarian free will is the word of the day, is the order of the day, is what at the end of the day most everybody is taught to subscribe to. And what I'm trying to point out is that these are not two separate poles. These are both ideas that in line everyone learns. The first thing you learn is free will. The first thing you learn is the assumption that when I lift my arm, that's me wanting to lift my arm. That's the first thing you learn. It's not until later that you come to the realization that I lifted my arm because I was, provoked by the idea of showing you my free will to lift my arm. And it's a development. It's not two separate poles. It's not looking in two separate directions. It's just coming to the logical conclusion. And what I'm saying is the institutionalizing of free will, libertarian free will as the order of the day, is what keeps many people from getting past the point of free will and saying, hey, maybe there isn't free will. Maybe everything is kind of cause and effect. And essentially, society has been kept from growing and from prospering and essentially been controlled by the free will illusion, or the idea of free will being pushed by religious organizations, government organizations. It is a great way of control, and it is a great way for people to take personal responsibility. But I think the negatives outweigh that. The egos outweigh that, because essentially, at some point, everybody who has done terrible things in this world has gone off the rails and stopped listening to everybody else because they thought they were right. And they didn't think they were right because of everybody around them. They thought they were right because they thought they were in some sort of a vacuum that made them able to know things that other people couldn't.
Look, I think the problem, I have a number of problems with this argument. The first is that it's incredibly generic. You can point to any system of thought and say, well, you can't really comment on my system of thought because we've never seen what it would be like in practice. It's the same argument Marxists use, right? It's the whole we've never done, proper communism. If only it was communism from an entire generation, then it would be great. But you can put, but the reality is that in the world at the moment, even if free will is the default paradigm, I don't think it is like there is no notions or no instances of where people don't believe in it. Because I don't know what the schooling system necessarily is like in America, but I never took a class which said free will exists. I think the only time I've ever been exposed to this paradigm was maybe in first year politics, and there was an essay about nature versus nurture, which presented it, by the way, as a debate, right? Like nature versus nurture. Nearly everyone has heard of that dichotomy. So I don't think that even if free will is the default, which lots of people believe in, I think they believe in it because they feel it to be true, not because they've been taught it and indoctrinated, which means there are lots of people and instances in society which do believe in determinism and do believe in determinist and make deterministic arguments. And you can look at the patterns of their behavior and draw inferences as to what their behavior might likely be if everyone believed that. And that's so I think that it isn't enough to say we just don't know, so it's probably better, right? Because that also is a double-edged sword. That also reduces your ability to make any positive claims about how it could be beneficial. Because if you say, look, we don't know anything about this, so you can't say it could be worse, that also means that you don't know anything about it and you can't say it might be better. All you can do is point to what things are like now and then say, by a random chance, it couldn't possibly be worse. And then you're saying about the ills of today's society, which I would say, honestly, you're giving a pretty prosperous society a really bad rap. Like, just mathematically, most civilizations have disintegrated, have killed the vast majority of people in them, have gone terribly south, have been stricken with poverty, disease, starvation. We are extremely lucky to be where we are. And just mathematically, right, we have never had so many people lifted out of poverty, in living in areas of prosperity, have as many freedoms as we have had now. You've dropped out, bugger. But yeah, in general, I think that just if we're going to be governing random chance, we've hit the jackpot, and we should toss it all away for what we don't know. Your video's dropped out. Can you still hear me?
Sorry,
right.
I was a moment there. You said happy people living in areas of poverty and prosperity, something.
Basically, what I was saying is that if you compared the society we live in now to all of the other set of societies which have existed on Earth, we are doing the best on nearly every marker. Everyone is universally more wealthy, less poverty, more freedoms. So just mathematically, if you wanted to do random chance, we've hit the jackpot. So yeah.
Well, and as I said, you've hit me in the biggest blind spot I see in this argument, is that I have no frame of reference to say what it would be like if we did institutionalize a deterministic universe, and if we were to try and teach people out of free will earlier, not too early. Obviously, you want to get the initial idea of free will and know that you are a causer. You are an acting agent of cause, but it's not until after that you learn you're determined through those causes. And I think the natural progression of human development leads to that in most people. And I hope that one day you'll come to the point I've come to, or maybe I'll just fall off the evolutionary ladder because I'm completely wrong. But I like to hope that I've seen a little bit further due to some of my research and some of my own life experiences, and I tend to think that it's through most of my failures that I've learned the most. And I've had quite a few failures in my life, maybe more than most people.
Right, yeah. Well, look, I've very much enjoyed our discussion. Hopefully it was the dialectic exercise which you had hoped for.
It was. I really agree. I enjoyed it, and I hope you got a little bit out of it as much as I got out of it. I do have a greater respect, I can say, after our conversation for the existence of free will as we understand it, and the benefits that it's caused. You've pointed some of those out.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. By the way, you should definitely join one of the tournaments. You're quite a well-spoken, well-reasoned individual.
I did. I entered the tournament, and only I think 7 people voted on my tournament. I said and about 300 times, and I think people probably started watching before the end of the video. So I need some practice.
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously you've done your research on this topic, so it's easier to speak to it with with confidence. But I mean, yeah, like look, there's a tournament every month, and there's a big one at the end of the year, and that'd be fun. I'm actually judging I'm actually judging this one, but I'll be in it for the next one. So yeah, look, I hope to see you there.
All right, thanks. I look forward to it.
Excellent, no worries. See ya.
See ya.